My guest today is Michael Quan. Michael is an early retiree who previously founded an IT services company, which he ran for a decade until he exited the business through an acquisition. While running his company, he saved and invested, growing his portfolio of stocks and real estate to $2 million before retiring at age 36. He now blogs at financiallyalert.com and co-hosts a podcast called Breakthrough Millionaire. His story has been featured in Business Insider, MarketWatch, and the Huffington Post, among other media outlets. And I invited Michael to the podcast today to share his perspective as someone who retired early with a family and young children in tow, and in particular, how he thought about financial independence and making early retirement work for a family's budget, as opposed to the typical bachelor's budget you often hear fire stories about. Michael, thanks so much for joining us today to share insights and tips on retiring early with a young family.
Thanks, Andrew. It's my pleasure to be here.
I'd love to just start by helping our audience orient a little bit. In what year did you early retire?
Yeah, so it would have been the year of 2000. Let's see, I was 36 at the time. And so it would have been 2000. Shoot, I don't know what my time frame is.
Or roughly is fine.
It was about 2012. Well, 2013. Actually, it was 2013.
Gotcha.
So I sold the business at 2011, and then basically I stayed on for a transition and then exited at 2013.
Okay, got it. So it's been like 7-8 years. And if your kids were already born by then, what were the ages of your kids when you early retired? And how many did you have?
Yeah, at the time, I only had one daughter, and she was 1 at the time. So she was pretty young.
Oh, wow. Okay, gotcha. And today, you have more?
I have one more. So I've got a son now.
Gotcha.
He came like maybe a year later. So they're about 2 years apart.
Okay, so one pre-retirement, one post-retirement. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Gotcha. What was your career path before retiring?
So prior to that, I used to be in the IT business. So what happened was I went to school in San Diego to UCSD. And down there, I didn't really know what I wanted to study, like a lot of kids at a high school. And so I was exploring a bunch, stayed undeclared for as long as I could until they said, no, you have to choose something. So I actually chose economics because it had the fewest number of requirements to get out of school. So I was like, well, I want to get out in 4, but I still don't know what I want to do. So I'll do econ. So that's what I chose, was econ. As I exited college, I realized that I still had no clue what I wanted to do with this econ degree. And I was noticing at the time that some of my other friends that had gone into computer science, computer engineering, things of that nature were getting a lot of jobs. It was at the time when the .com industry was taking off and things were really, great in the economy. And so I was like, that's interesting. So I actually ended up going into IT because I had a background in gaming, I guess you could say, in college. So, I took apart computers and put them back together, trying to get the fastest, hardware that you could to get an edge over other players. And ultimately, I transitioned that experience into IT support and IT integration. So like networking and taking care of routers and things of that nature. So it was nothing related to economics at all, especially in the beginning. And that's how I wound up in IT. And what happened though was, over time, I was only working for a company for a good year or so when they got acquired by a bigger company during this whole .com acquisition time. And probably within like 6 months, 9/11 occurred. Mm-hmm. And so we had, an office in New York, LA, like different places. And, it just literally threw not just our company, but the entire economy in upheaval. And so, people started, panicking. People started, didn't know what to do because obviously the economy just literally ground to a halt. And my good buddy, Tony, he got basically eliminated in rounds of layoffs. And then one of my other friends, Jenny, she got eliminated. And so it's just like, oh man, what's going on? This really sucks. Like, what are they going to do? They had families, and I didn't at the time, but I was just like, what are you going to do if you can't work? Like, that would totally suck. And so got to about the 6th round of layoffs. And I was just like, you know what? I kind of see where this is going. Am I going to sit around here and just wait for that to happen? Or am I going to take some action? And so what happened was I went to one of my buddies in the company and said, hey, are we just going to sit around and wait for this to just all crumble down? maybe we should do this on our own. And so what happened was we were actually a part of this grander, bigger IT company, and our group was actually the only profitable component. So we were like, well, we definitely know there's a market there. People still need their businesses to be supported. So we got a couple other friends and we're like, let's take off and do our own thing. And so that's actually how we actually ended up starting our own business. Is we filled a need early on as our other company was imploding. And so that's how we jumped off. And yeah, I was very fortunate that, I was able to start a company during a very downtime, after 9/11. But there was still a need, there was still a market. And I think that's something for the listeners to maybe, listen to is, as far as your journey to fire and stuff, there's always opportunities.
Got it. So, and with the company you started, you were doing the same thing as your your previous company. Is it like network support?
Yeah. So we're doing network integration, IT support, IT security, and then end user support as well.
Gotcha. How long did you run that business before it sounds like you exited?
Yeah, so we ran that, ourselves. There was just 3 or 4 of us in the beginning, and we did everything. So, we got down on the floors and plugged in cables and helped end users. And then slowly over time, we started figuring some things out. Eventually, we ended up landing some bigger contracts and then hiring on some additional people. And then eventually, you start building processes out. And I always knew from the get-go that I wanted something that was at least self-sustaining, that didn't require my input for the long term. So, it took me a little longer than I wanted to. 10 years is actually longer than I thought it would take me, but so be it. And, after doing that, basically putting people and managers in place so that it could basically run itself was the goal. And then at that point, basically, we had an opportunity to transition because we got a inquiry to sell a company, as well as once we got the inquiry, I went out and looked for other people and kind of played them off each other. And yeah, that was kind of the evolution of my IT career path. And the reason, I definitely loved it. It was a really good time. I learned so much. I learned a lot about running a business. We were providing value. The reason why I decided to exit was, I'd done it for quite a while, and I was looking for something else on a personal level to grow somewhere else. And some of my partners, were happy and satisfied just kind of running this business kind of more like as a lifetime business, versus I wanted something that was more scalable. So I decided that, it was time to move on. As well as it was very stressful. We had a number of money managers that were our clients. And so just being, responsible for so much IT infrastructure at times was kind of stressful. So I was like, I want to do something different. So.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. So it sounds like it was, if I'm understanding correctly, it was essentially a professional services firm that ultimately you guys sold. And then it sounds like, did you retire immediately after that? Was there anything that happened between the time you sold the company and the time you retired?
Yeah. So essentially what happened is once we exited, I ended up signing like a 3-year employment agreement with the company to stay on and transition, just to keep culture intact. And got through about a year and a half of that, realized that the company that we'd sold to had different values than us. For example, they didn't pay their bills on time, and they would just slow pay people and try to I won't even get into it, but they had different values and morals than we did. So there's definitely a difference of opinion on how to run a company. And, they did what they did. And so I was like, this is not really in line with my values and how I treat other people or businesses. So I was like, I want out. Let's figure out a way to separate ways. And so we came to figure out a way to, get a severance package. And I left around, I think, a year and a half after that occurred. And that was my exit into early retirement. It wasn't necessarily well planned out, as we'll probably get into.
Gotcha. So, leaving a company that you had started and sold, I imagine like there would have been a lot of professional options available to you at that point. When did you decide that you wanted to actually just retire early? Was there a single moment of recognition, or did you gradually realize it? And why? Help us understand why you didn't decide or want to start a new business or join as an executive at another company, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. And so let me take a quick step back. Actually, when I was growing up, I actually had a couple uncles that had done very well for themselves. And they basically never went to work. And I just didn't understand why. And I was like, dude, how come they don't have to work? And my parents have to work and like whatever else. I'm like, this is interesting. And they always took their kids to school. They went on vacation all the time. And like, they're always tinkering at projects at home. And I'm like, how come they don't have to work? And, eventually I realized that they, had basically become financial independent. And I didn't know the word obviously when I was really young, but I realized that I wanted that early on, like very early on, probably like when I was like 7 or 8. And as I continued on, I started to, continue to notice that. And I was very close to, some of these uncles and whatnot, because we spent a lot of time with these families. And so, of course I get to benefit a little bit of it. I get to go on vacations with them. But by the time I was about 14 or so, I picked up a book by Tony Robbins called Unlimited Power. And it was just a very interesting book because it really taught me that, hey, age doesn't matter and you can do anything that you want so long as you, model successful people and you take the right action. So for the longest time, I knew that I wanted to find, well, in my head, it was called financial freedom back then, but ultimately financial independence, where ultimately I could find freedom to do whatever I want to do. That was definitely a goal from very early on. Fast forward, that was one of the stimuluses for me to, actually take that leap of faith back when, the economy was imploding. That was part of the mindset to, let's go ahead and do something. Let's create a business. It may fail, but it's okay. I'm young. I've got time. And it was a perfect situation, right? I mean, the economy was, crashing around us with my existing company, and there was an opportunity. So, I definitely took it, and I definitely tailored the business to the point of exit in that mindset. However, when I actually transitioned, it wasn't like specifically, okay, I'm actually defining this period of time. But so by the time I exited, I had flexibility. And I think that was the key. I really had that flexibility at that point to basically say, hey, you know what? I don't actually need to go back into a professional situation yet. And part of my decision to stay at home was that, like I was mentioning earlier, my daughter was 1 at the time. And so it's really interesting, like how different life situations affect you, right? And unfortunately, my mom had passed away maybe just a few years before that from cancer. And, we didn't have a lot of time when we actually found out. It was like late stage 4. And, I think that affects you when you're growing up. Whenever, a family member passes, it affects you. But the gift in that was that it allowed me to appreciate life more. And so when I finally took that exit and my daughter was 1, I was like, you know what? I have a very unique opportunity here to take this time and be present with my daughter. And I was like, I could go back to work, of course, that's easy. I could go get a very good, high paying job. But why did I do all this in the first place? It's because I ultimately wanted the ultimate freedom, and I'm never going to get this time back. So I was like, you know what? Why don't I try staying home for a while? We'll save on the cost of a nanny, and I can just spend this time being fully present. And so that's what I did. It was kind of a trial and error, and yeah, that's what happened. That's kind of where it all started from. It was just a little bit of a trial and error to see how things would work.
Gotcha. So what was the life that you envisioned having in retirement uh, when at the cusp of when you were making this decision?
Yeah. So the funny thing was, so at first when I finally kind of put my head around like, okay, I'm going to do this early retirement thing, like a lot of people, when you're going through like your fire planning, like I'm writing a book right now and I have a whole section on fire planning. It's great to kind of have fun goals that you have set out in place and what you're going to do when you finally pull the trigger. And so one of the things that I did was, had a number of different bucket list items. So before we actually told the nanny not to come anymore, I took like a good 8 or 9 months to just kind of go out there and do whatever the heck I wanted. And so I spent time going to do a lot of fishing. I love fishing. So I had the freedom to go fish whenever I wanted to. I liked to do things outdoors. And I also wanted to always be in the movie business when I was younger. So I liked special effects and things blowing up and things of that nature. So I actually went out to Florida and I took a special effects course from a company that actually did special effects for the big amusement companies and the film industry. And so I got to blow up a car. So that was one of the fun things for me, at least. Some of you might be thinking, why is that fun? But for me, it was highly fun. And, just really kind of got to experience that and explore that. And I even actually explored hey, would I potentially want to do this professionally? And in the end, I didn't, but it was really fun to explore. And I think that was one of the biggest things with FIRE, and for listeners, as you continue to explore this journey, is the freedom that you get to just try different things is amazing. But ultimately, once the 8 months were over and I was done having fun and playing, I ultimately kind of came back to that, ultimate goal of, okay, let's kind of settle down a little bit and be a little strategic. And for, money purposes, obviously we didn't need a nanny in house and just me running around doing, random things. Plus, at a point, you also realize that you still need to grow. And in order to grow, you need to do something that's meaningful. So for me, what was meaningful at the time was basically taking care of my daughter, raising her as my wife was going to work. And that was kind of the focus for the next few years, actually, was being a stay-at-home dad and just being fully present.
Gotcha. So the 8 or 9 month sort of exploration period that you talked about a moment ago, was that the first 8 to 9 months of early retirement, or the last 8 to 9 months of your working period?
It was a little bit of both. So I'd probably say half. So kind of when you're in transition and exiting out, like, you're not necessarily being held accountable to do certain things. So I had more flexibility. So I'd take half the time to go fishing after I was done with the day. And then, but finally, when I did pull the trigger, that's when I had even more flexibility to go travel and do different things. Or, just be at home and do projects at home.
Gotcha. So was there a specific savings target you had set for yourself for when you knew you were FIRE ready? Or maybe framed another way, how did you come up with your FIRE number? What were the considerations that went into it? How did you know how did you get clarity on what the burn rate would be that you would need, factoring in things like, child expenses, medical, travel, unexpected or emergency expenses? I'm sure there was probably a buffer that you cushioned in, things like that. How did you come up with your FIRE number?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew, and something that I really wish I knew at the time. But honestly, at the time, I didn't know. And some of this kind of stems back to, again, when I was a child, because I just realized, oh, to be rich means to be a millionaire. So I was like, okay, let me set my sights on being a millionaire by the time I'm 30. And so that was kind of the goal, was to be a millionaire by the time I was 30. And, thankfully I reached that goal through the business and through savings and ultimately through some real estate. But it also limited me, because you kind of set your sights on a goal and then you hit it, and then you don't necessarily have anything else to grow towards after that. So you have to do some reallocation. And that's something that, I teach my students currently. But what happened was I kind of just had this random round number of $1 million. So I was like, I just thought back then, because with inflation, I didn't understand inflation, $1 million was a lot of money. Present day, obviously, $1 million is not as much money as it once was before. And so what I really did was I kind of just had this in the back of my head, was this $1 million number. And I didn't, to be honest, I didn't really kind of plan out some of the expenses until, again, I got to that point where I had exited the company. And then it was kind of exploring, right? So I had always been good at least understanding my cash flow. So I was still relatively conservative, and I still had cash flow coming in from the sale of the business. So there was still, significant cash flow coming in from there. My wife was still working, so we still had excess. So we're still saving even once I exited the business. So we had some flexibility there. So I didn't really have to worry too much there. Long term, though, I started to finally realize, okay, at some point, obviously the spigot's going to turn off, and I'm not going to get these installment payments anymore. And so once that happened, yeah, we started to basically redirect funds and be a little bit more conservative with how we were living. Although, it didn't affect us that much, to be honest. And part of that was because my wife is a school teacher and she's just very passionate about it. She's one of those rare people that actually loves her job and would literally almost do it for free. So she had no plans on basically firing with me, even though we could have done that. We talked about it and said, okay, well, do you want to exit as well? And we're probably not going to live in California. We'd probably gone and lived in maybe Texas somewhere, somewhere with lower taxes. We could have just bought like a house that was, same size, but, a quarter of the price, and just, lived off of that for quite some time. But ultimately, we decided we didn't want to do that. She didn't want to do that. She loved her job. She loved her position. So like, okay, that's fine. Let's look at other ways that we can basically adjust costs. Now, of course, we were saving money on the nanny stuff because I was at home with my kids. And then we also did something in San Diego. San Diego's a pretty big area, kind of like where you're up in the Bay Area, it spans a pretty large area. So there's different parts and components to the counties, right? And so we decided to actually move down to where she was teaching, which was a lower cost of living than where we were at, which was kind of central San Diego, kind of very urban. And so we're like, you know what? I'm not working. You work down here. Why don't we just move like, a mile away from where you're working? We're going to save on gas. I don't need to commute anywhere. Really nice suburbia neighborhood that's growing out around there. And we're going to save, probably a good, few $100s a month, maybe even more just in gas plus mortgage. And so then we ultimately ended up buying a house down there and keeping the other one as a rental. And yeah, I think that was the evolution of just kind of slowly going through the numbers over time. In hindsight, of course, I wish I had taken more time to really understand, how the numbers had worked. At the time, I didn't understand the 4% rule. I didn't understand kind of 25 times your expenses. But I will tell you that even though at the time I didn't really understand that, in the back of my head, I will tell you that I always knew that I wanted to be conservative. So even though I had saved up, at the time, actually, just so you know, when I finally exited, we were maybe a little bit over $1 million in net worth. And so we didn't reach the 2 million till later on when, we had the great run of the last 10 years. However, I always knew that I wanted to be conservative. So in my mind, I would say if I'd gone back and extrapolated, I was probably targeting closer to about 30 times expenses in terms of where I would be living at. So in other words, if my wife was not working and we actually had both fired at the same time, then we would have probably reduced our expenses to the point where we had, we were only spending 30 times, let's just say it was $1.5 million at the time, divided, by 30 years or whatever, we would have spent that amount of money, for the year, and been very conservative in that regard. So I don't think our money would have ever run out, but our lifestyle would have definitely been different had she not been working.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay, so it sounds like there was a sort of a general pragmatism and conservatism when it came to spending, but you didn't do like sort of crazy complex scenario planning, so to speak.
Not at the time.
So how did having kids or being a parent influence your planning for early retirement? Like, how did you make sure your kids would be well covered financially in early retirement, especially, I guess, when you had your second after retirement? Because I imagine that also shifted things. Young children at such a, small children at a young age, raising kids is expensive in San Diego. I'm sure it's not cheap. There's, even if you're saving on a nanny, eventually there's preschool. You want to make sure your kid is getting good socialized and learning things, enrichment activities, not to mention food and medical and clothes and all the gear and supplies that you need. How did having kids and having a second kid shape your retirement planning or change it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Andrew. And what was really interesting about that time and being home with my kids was, man, we saved a lot of money because specifically, I was home with the kids. I was talking to all my other friends that were spending money on the nannies and doing the daycares and doing the preschools, when they're going to work. I mean, people are spending, sometimes like 20, 30 grand on this a year. I mean, that's significant money. And obviously in California, this might be a little bit higher than, where you're living across the country or whatnot. But in terms of, just those sheer cost savings that we had by me being home was significant. And because I was home with them, I was cooking their own meals. I was, taking them grocery shopping. I was being helping to supplement some of their, developmental learning. So we didn't ever put them into a private preschool, although we had intended to actually at the time. I realized, what, why not do it myself? And so what we did was we would put them into some of the city subsidized, they had like some sort of kind of preschool planning. It was more socialization than anything. And then we would supplement the academics. So we kind of liked that kind of mix of things because my wife was a teacher, I had the free time, and then I knew exactly what we were teaching them versus what we weren't. And then with the the city kind of program where they were actually getting interaction with the kids was great because they're just going there and basically playing and interacting on a social level. So we did kind of that roundabout way. But the great thing about that was those programs actually didn't cost that much money. And so we were able to save there. And it didn't really actually cost us that much in those early years to support them. And so it was actually interesting to figure that out. I also had a lot of clothes for my sister who had just had a child, maybe like a couple of years in advance. So, she gave us all the car seats and the clothes and things of that nature.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that stuff adds up. So if you can
it really adds up to a lot. And if you have someone that, and I think that's one tip for people is that, when you have a child in the beginning, you're just like, you want to give them everything. You want to give them the world. You want to give them the best of the best. And at a certain point, you realize, what? Some of that doesn't actually mean physical things. It means giving them time and the attention. And some of those physical things, like once you buy it, you might do it in the beginning. Like in the beginning, you might buy all these new things for them. And then all of a sudden, like they grow up in like 6 months and they don't fit them. Or you realize, what? I can't use this anymore. This has no more value to me. How much money did I spend on this? And then you're like, okay, well, at least want it to go to someone who's going to make use of it. And so you either sell it on Craigslist or whatever, or you give it to someone that, obviously is close to you. And once you kind of come to that realization, then you're like, what? Maybe I don't need to spend it on the brand new thing this next time around. And so that's kind of exactly what we did. We had a lot of great family and friends, and it supplemented, of course we bought some things, but it wasn't enough to really throw us off of our budgeting and our cash flow.
Yeah. So did you know at the time that you fired, did you know you were going to have a second child, or did you think you would have a second child, or did that the decision to have a second kid come completely after you fired?
We did definitely intend on having a second child. And so in terms of cash flow, we were definitely looking at it every month. This was before the days of, automation and whatnot. I had a big spreadsheet and would always track, what was kind of coming in and out. And so again, I was always kind of in the conservative mind of like, okay, well, when I exited, we were saving about probably 50% of our inbound revenues. Once, my income basically got wiped out, then it was basically down to just my wife's, and we were still saving, a good 20 some percent or whatnot. So I was like, well, as long as we're not like dipping too far below, then we can have, as many kids as we want. Although granted, my wife only wanted one more. I was like, we can have even more. But ultimately we ended up on 2 just for personal reasons. And it was a matter of just kind of making sure that it always kept within the budget and to adjust. I think that's one of the other things just for the listeners is like having flexibility is really key, because even after you fire, a lot of times nowadays in the media, it's like, you start building up this very specific nest egg and then you withdraw a very specific number. And as someone that's done it, I just want you to know that you always have the flexibility to adjust. So, sometimes people worry about the sequence of returns, meaning that like, oh, what happens if you start withdrawing your money and it actually is in a down economy and then your portfolio starts getting wiped out? There's always things that you can do to mitigate these risks live in real time. So don't ever feel that you're like stuck into a very specific, tight little hole little square peg that you can't basically get out of. There's a lot of flexibility even after you fire.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And reacting to the circumstances that are actually happening on the ground is really critical to making sure fire is successful. And it sounds like in your case, you at the time you decided to fire, even though you only had one, you were essentially already preparing for a second. So is it fair to say that you were planning fire for two children?
Yeah, absolutely. And what happened was actually my wife did take some time off when she had our children. So like when my daughter was born, even before I exited, she took time off and was really present with them for a good 8 months. So she took that time off from being a teacher. And then also when my son was born as well, she took that time as well. So there was periods where she was not even working for a good 8 months, and then there was periods after that where she was only working maybe like 2/3 of the time. So it was a really great time for us to really kind of be together as a family unit and really get to experience the real fire life where she's not working, I'm not working, and we're just kind of focusing on the family. And so of course we had to account for that, and she's not getting income during that period. But again, we're conservative. We also did one thing I also want to mention was, as I was exiting the business, I, took some equity off the table. And so I was like, well, what am I going to do with this money? And so I realized that my uncles that had done very well for themselves had done a lot of this through real estate. So I had taken some of that money and invested in real estate as I was exiting, and just outside of in early retirement, I continued to invest in real estate. And so that gave us some additional cash flow.
Got it. That's a really good segue then. I'd love to understand, during your accumulation phase, when you were accumulating assets, and it sounds like when you were taking some equity off the table, like what proportion of your savings were going into different types of accounts or into alternative assets like real estate? So I'm thinking in particular of, things like tax deferred accounts, tax exempt accounts, versus taxable accounts. And by the time you actually retired, what proportion was in each bucket or in alternative classes like real estate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right out of school, out of college, I realized early on, and luckily my dad was a CPA, so he was kind of just conservative by nature. And so he always said, well, start doing your Roth IRA. And he was like, obviously this is a very great tax advantage account because you're not going to have to pay the money when you finally pull it out. So I was like, okay, I just did whatever he kind of said. But in the back of my head, I also was, really wanting to save 50% from the get-go. And so even before I got married, I was, really starting to save and invest. And so in the beginning, to be honest, it was kind of all over the place. So I was doing automated savings to this thing called, I think it was called, it's now Capital One 360, which was just an automated savings. And then I was also allocating money to Share Builder, which was a way that you could buy fractional shares in specific stocks. So back in the day, I was an active investor thinking that, I was going to figure out how to find the little, inefficiencies in the market and capitalize on them. And so I would, I actually had a taxable account where I was putting money in. And then I had the Roth IRA, as well as I had the 401k for my company that I first started working with. And then ultimately, when I left there and started my own business, then we had like our own SEP IRA, and so I was able to kind of put money into that account over time as well. So I would say over time, it was kind of about 30% into taxable accounts and about 70% tax advantage. So the majority of it, I would say, was in, by the time I had fired, it was probably in my SEP IRA or my, self-employment as a business owner. You have your own kind of 401k plan or whatnot. So it was in there, and then it became a rollover IRA once I left there. So I would say the mix was about 70% tax advantage accounts, including the Roth IRAs, and then 30% actually just money that I had saved that's, completely taxed already, and just growing in either savings or that Share Builder account at the time.
When did real estate come into the picture for you?
So real estate came into the picture basically maybe a year before I decided to exit. And that was because, I realized well, not only did I realize that I wanted to do this, I actually had wanted to invest in real estate for quite a long time. And what happened was I was studying forever about real estate investing. But the time that I actually got excited about it, we were in an up market. And so all the cash flow numbers and projections didn't really work out. So I was like, well, what's going on? And all these people were buying properties just based on the idea that it was going to go up in value. So they were banking on appreciation. And the more I read, the more I realized, hey, that's probably not really investing. That's more like speculating. And so I held out and I basically waited a good like 5 years until it was basically the year 2010. And then I started pulling the trigger. And that was literally 2 years after we had, this big downturn in the housing market of '08. And so I was able to go in and buy some properties in the Las Vegas area. And yeah, I wish I had bought more, but yeah, I bought 3 properties out there and they were great. They were cash flowing. I only put a little bit of money down, and over time they started, building up appreciation as well. And so the reason why I share that also is because as I was, kind of firing, so to speak, and staying home with my kids, of course I'm tracking my cash flow, but at the same time, I'm also seeing that the value of my properties are going up. So that gave me a little bit more comfortability that, things were going to be fine. I was going to be flexible and yeah, and things would work out.
Got it. Yeah, there was some amazing deals back in 2010. Those are long gone now.
But I think they're going to come back at some point.
Yeah, we'll see with this whole pandemic.
Maybe not
thing.
as good, but there's definitely going to be an opportunity to have better deals.
So by the time you retired, or I guess, yeah, you said you retired in 2013, started acquiring real estate in 2010. By the time you retired, what was the proportions? If you look at your kind of your whole net worth as a a pie chart, what proportion was in real estate versus in like stock investments?
Yeah. So not counting our primary residence, which, we had a fair amount of equity into there, I would say it was about a 50-50 split of, well, actually maybe a little bit less, maybe like a 30% real estate to 70% equities and, other miscellaneous investments.
Gotcha. And then double clicking on the securities and other miscellaneous investments, it sounds like that was roughly 30% taxable, 70% tax advantage. Is that right?
That's correct. And at the time when I exited, there was also, I had just a chunk of cash that was kind of sitting there as well. So one kind of, in addition, just to answer your question, as I was actually in the process of, early retirement, part of that was trying to figure out how do I best make use of this money. And so I realized that I wanted to be more heavily invested in real estate. So I wanted more than the 30%. So I actually took a good chunk of that cash and I put it more towards real estate. And because I had young children, it's not like I could really go out and, look at property as actively as I was before. So what I did instead was I actually did a number of crowdfunding investments, which are kind of like these mini syndications, essentially, which are group investments. And that was a great time too, because we were going in, I was pooling money with, different real estate investors. They would go into like a really expensive neighborhood like Beverly Hills, knock down a really old house, throw up a mansion, and they were making like 10 times their money. So it was a phenomenal time where I was getting, sometimes like 18% internal rate of return, which was phenomenal. So yeah, I definitely put more money into real estate after the fact.
Gotcha. And so when you were investing in securities at the time, what were you investing in? Like passive index funds, individual securities, fixed income? Like what were you actually buying?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So I had a maybe a common evolution of investing, maybe not. Maybe some people, yeah. Well, let me just take a step back. So I always knew that the stock market was a great potential place to grow your money. However, I had this belief in my head that you had to figure out how the market worked basically had to crack it, right? So that you could be on this, the top 10% to actually make money in the market. I always saw the statistics, the majority of people don't make money in the stock market. And I was like, you know what, I can figure this out. So I read a lot of books. I read a lot of, material, trying to figure out how to get that edge. And so, I would come up with these different theories of, why specific tech companies were going to outperform other companies. And using my tech knowledge, because I was in the industry, I theorized, okay, I have an edge over people. So when I saw the internet basically coming out, I could capitalize on different companies. Long story short was I did very well at certain times. I bought Amazon when it was $10 a share. But I also bought tons of dogs. And so over time, these things level out. And, although you have these great wins with Amazon, eBay, other things basically go to nothing and they average out. And so what I finally realized after a good 10 years of active investing was that I didn't really have that much to show for it, other than a lot of time spent really trying to understand the markets. And in that process, towards the end, I had started my blog, Financially Alert, and I started reading a lot of different blogs and understanding, what different people were doing and the whole kind of passive approach. And I was actually pretty I was like, oh, that would never work. This whole passive approach. And yeah, it'll work, but you're never going to get the real returns that I'm looking for. And ultimately, as I continued on through FIRE, I realized that I was, really not making that much more from being active. And I said, let me try half of my portfolio in a more passive capacity and just test. And so to a certain extent, I was already doing that with the 401k and different things, because that was just, I wasn't really actively managing certain accounts. And so kind of comparing them side by side, I looked, okay, here's my taxable accounts that I was actively managing. Here's my tax deferred ones that I'm not as actively managing. And the returns were about the same. So I was like, why am I spending all this time? I should be spending this time on real estate investing instead. And so basically at a certain point, I decided to push everything over to passive investing and basically clear out individual stocks. I'm actually still in the process of, just based on how you can manage things tax efficiently. But now I'm completely a passive investor, meaning that, I'm putting it all into index funds. I'm letting it grow long-term over time. And then I'm taking that time, focusing it on real estate and entrepreneurship.
Yep, that makes sense. So by the time you retired, is it, I was just trying to synthesize what we were discussing earlier. So it sounds like you had roughly $1 million in investments, like in your portfolio, and then ballpark something like another 300K in physical real estate. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, I'd say that was roughly correct.
Gotcha. Okay, so now during, like, once you had fired, what has been your approach to determining how much you can afford to withdraw every year so that you feel comfortable about outlasting your nest egg? Do you generally apply the 4% rule in a fairly straightforward way, or is there more nuance to your approach? And if I understand correctly, your spouse has not yet followed you into early retirement, so she's still working. So this could be moot in the sense that, if her income alone is sufficient for your day-to-day living expenses, then obviously you're not withdrawing anything. But curious how you've been thinking about this.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Andrew. And you're correct, because my wife is still working. We're kind of more along the barista fire, which basically means someone's still working and you're able to save on healthcare and other kind of ancillary items that other people that are completely fired have to worry about. So I will tell you that, yes, we have some flexibility in that regard. And so that definitely helps. However, we did kind of run through the numbers, like I was mentioning before, if she had basically decided to basically exit. And so if we had done that, we would have potentially moved somewhere, like I was saying, maybe like Texas or Florida, somewhere that, there was lower income tax, Nevada, wherever it may have been, and obviously much lower cost of living. So we could have just basically taken equity from our existing house, basically bought another house, had additional savings that we could either put into the stock market or put into other real estate that would provided cash flow. So the nice thing about, I think, as our listeners kind of go through running the numbers, is the 4% rule is a great rule of thumb. It gets you in the ballpark of where you need to be, understanding what you need to withdraw from your accounts as you draw down over time. However, because I was more conservative, I always wanted some sort of ancillary cash flow, and that meant real estate. So even if you're generating just like $1,000 a month of additional cash flow, that can significantly make a difference whether you need to withdraw 4% from your portfolio or not. I mean, if you can make a shift and you only have changes like, by a half, another, instead of 4%, you only have to draw 3%. I mean, that's significant, right? And so definitely, I think I'm more along the lines of being conservative, of where you don't necessarily have to draw down that 4%. It's good to know that it's there and that you can do it. And if I did actually need to, live off of those funds, I would have done like, the Roth conversion ladder, which essentially is basically pulling money from your Roth IRA tax-free, because you've already paid taxes in it. And you have to season it, for a while if you're going to put it in traditional IRA. But I essentially would have just pulled from there and just taken it slowly over time and adjusted. I think, again, we talked about this earlier, there's flexibility in FIRE. Knowing your numbers is fantastic. It gives you that confidence to basically move forward. And in my case, it was no different, right? We had the flexibility. My wife didn't have to work if she didn't want to, but she chose to. And because she chose to, obviously she gets to, have fulfillment in her work. But at the same time, it affords us a different level of living now at this point. So how I live now is not necessarily how I would have lived on a pure FIRE kind of scale, I guess, so to speak. And, to be honest, the only difference would have been significantly less eating out, because we spent a lot of money on eating out.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how did you, you alluded to it a moment ago, how did you plan for healthcare and insurance costs? And, what did you do for health? What do you do for health insurance now? Or did you always know that you would just be on your spouse's plan because she's still working?
Yeah. So that was definitely one of the, consideration was like, there's obviously a lot of savings there with my wife's healthcare plan. And because she's a teacher, some of that's also subsidized by the district. So that was a really nice, value add right there in terms of running the numbers for FIRE. However, if you also looked, what if she didn't work or whatnot? And in that case, you'd be at a much lower income bracket, right? And then you would get access to the Affordable Care Act plans. And so, we would have obviously gone with something like that to basically, get our health care. And so it would have been manageable. And for the most part, I think, with healthcare, a lot of the plans are similar. You can still use some of the same providers. And so that doesn't really shift in that regard. And so being that we're young, you have some flexibility. So you don't need like all the bells and whistles. We didn't need like the whole, PPO thing where we were choosing, exact doctor. We're fine with an HMO. We barely go to the doctor anyway. So.
Gotcha. So, so now you've been in early retirement 7-8 years. It's been, you've been essentially doing this for a while. Have there been any large unexpected expenses that have come up over the years that put stress on your retirement finances and maybe made you rethink, like, should I go back and get a job or not? Just curious, like how the 7-8 years have unfolded in terms of any, large unexpected expenses.
Yeah, in terms of unexpected expenses, there hasn't been anything major, to be honest. The only thing that I would say that was in the back of our head was just potentially parents. So like, as our parents get older, my mom's already passed, my dad, he's self-sufficient. But my wife's family, they're pretty good, but they may need some assistance. And so just having that in the back of your head, that there's a cash flow component that you have to account for later on, is always important, right? So, we haven't had to, go there at this point yet, but there's always that possibility that we would have to, help out my wife's family.
Makes sense. And do you account for that just by building in, cushioning in a buffer?
Yeah. So from the early days, I really kind of just thought, okay, let's kind of set aside, like, in our minds or in our projections, I don't know, maybe one of the houses, like with the cash flow and all that stuff, is going to be going to them at some point. and all the appreciated equity from there. And then, if anything ever happens, that could cover them, so to speak.
Makes
So
sense.
yeah, it's definitely, and continues to be, a factor in what we consider over time.
So what does your portfolio look like now, 7, 8 years later, compared to when you first early retired?
Yeah. So I was very fortunate, obviously, when I exited the workplace, because we were going into a really great bull run for the last like 10 years. And so again, you can't really plan that per se. I'm not smart enough to say that I planned it exactly, but I was actually able to benefit from that because over the time, even though I wasn't working, I wasn't making income, the portfolio has grown. And so net worth, when we exited, I was, I told you, it was a little bit over 1 million, and now it's, we're roughly about 2.3 million overall net worth. And so the portfolio is roughly, maybe I would say close to double, but maybe not as much. I don't know exactly. I forgot to check that one specifically.
Yeah, the 2010 to 2020 run was definitely huge. So if you retired early in that window, you definitely got a lot of tailwinds behind your back for sure. Um, we're in a funny situation now, and I'm curious, like, has the coronavirus altered your plans in any way, or pretty much still business as usual?
Coronavirus hasn't really altered anything. Business as usual for me, um, because obviously I'm at home with my kids. I'm very fortunate. I would say the one thing that did kind of derail my little short-term plans or whatnot was, so for the past few years, I've obviously been home with my kids and being very direct in their lives, but they've also gone now to elementary school, and my son this last year had just gone to kindergarten. So finally I was kind of like like a mini empty nester, right? So I had more time to myself to do my projects and work on my investments and my little business side projects like the blog and my coaching. And so I was really going to really focus in on that. And obviously with coronavirus, they've all come home. So they're at home constantly 24/7 now, versus before I had like these 8-hour windows where I could go, do whatever I wanted. So in that regard, that's the only effect I think of, the coronavirus. But again, I'm very blessed, obviously, that we still get to, remain very comfortable in our cash flow position. Um, my wife's job wasn't affected. I know a lot of other people, have been affected, and, you know, knock on wood, all of our tenants actually have not, defaulted at all. So, yeah, things have been working out.
Gotcha. So how do you spend your days now, like during normal daytime hours? Like, what's your routine, and like maybe pre-coronavirus and post-coronavirus?
Yeah. So pre-coronavirus, when I actually had the time to myself, I dropped my kids off to school. I would take, usually I'd walk them to school, and then I go home and I have a good 4 hours that I would just focus working on the blog. I would work on, sometimes I'd be working on real estate investments. I'd be working on, other random projects, or sometimes I just take the day off and go fishing, to be honest. And now, fast forward to now that they're back home, now it's more, a little bit more hands-on, making sure that they kind of get some of their work in the morning. And then sometimes they want to play basketball and do different things. We go on family bike rides. So that's a good chunk of the day now, is just really kind of being engaged with them, keeping them active during the summertime now as well. And then also for myself, I've just transitioned a good chunk of my working time to basically late at night.
Hmm.
So literally, sometimes it's like from midnight to 4 in the morning, just is when I can get my stuff. I'm actually in the process of writing a book specifically about fire. And I use that kind of late night window where everyone's asleep, where I can just kind of focus and hone in and create content.
Makes sense. Cool. So, one thing I wanted to ask, I forgot earlier, is that you mentioned that like your real estate portfolio has grown a lot. Like, how many doors are you at this point?
Yeah. So right now, so I bought 3 in Vegas at the time, kept 2 of them. We also kept our townhome in San Diego. So we had 3 from there. We also had some other property in Los Angeles. And then a lot of the investments that I've done subsequently actually are in either crowdfunding
Mm.
or in syndication. So like, um, Like, for example, I'm in these properties in San Antonio, Texas, where basically it's a pooled investment, but I put a chunk of change into it. And so we own like 280 units of this Class B apartment in San Antonio. And so what I really like about syndications, though, is you get to leverage the skill set of a professional real estate investor. You still have to do your due diligence, and you still have to understand what the market looks like. But if you find a good one, then you simply hand them over your money, and it's very passive. Like, they basically kind of take it and they give you a return every quarter. And then by the time they finally do exit the position, then you get all your money back plus more.
Got it. And are these syndications you find through like crowdfunding websites, or you knew the partners like directly?
A combination of both. So basically, sometimes it's through crowdfunding places. Other times it's through a network of people that I basically have come to know. And so sometimes they're private.
Like through your local RIA, or just through like networking online?
Just networking actually. So actually, from blogging, it's interesting, because I don't. Have you gone to FinCon, Andrew? It's like
I
the
haven't
big
yet.
bloggers conference.
I think I thought about going this year, but it's going to be different this year because of all the pandemic stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And after that plays out or whatever, definitely I would say, to check it out. And the reason why is that I went there just obviously to learn more about blogging, how to learn how to, market better and create better content. But in the process of there, actually, I met a number of real estate investors, because there's a whole segment of real estate investors within the blogging world of finance, which is fascinating to me. And so that's actually how I found some of my syndicated deals, was actually from other investors who blog. And then, yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. So how does having kids and the family now at this point influence how you think about wealth building during FIRE, in terms of ensuring that you want to give your kids every opportunity, maybe have a college tuition fund ready for them, assuming you're planning for that? How does that impact how you think about wealth building these days?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Andrew. And my thoughts around this have evolved over time. So my initial idea was to basically create enough wealth so that they're basically just taken care of. They can have all their college tuition paid. And I'll tell you, I was very fortunate. My parents paid for my college tuition, so I didn't have to, work that much while I was going to school. However, in the process of all this, I realized that like part of FIRE is really learning how to grow and understand who you are, and being present with my children, and being a parent. There's just a philosophy that you have to start to adopt or create on your own, right? Everyone has a different philosophy as far as parenting. And what I realized over time was that, although I can give my kids everything that they want, it doesn't necessarily mean that I should. And so, even though I can buy them, all the toys and all the stuff, that's not really what I want them to value. I want them to value learning to be in uncomfortable situations so they can figure something out. I want them to be hungry to understand that how do you create value in this world and spread it out into this world? And how do you become entrepreneurial so that it's just an indicator of like the value that you're creating? And how do you, ultimately grow yourself? And so sometimes I think that means not giving them money. And my idea of, fully funding their college tuition has actually shifted. So before I was just like, I'll just knock it out. I'll just pay for it, just like my parents. But I thought about it and I was like, you know what? I think they need skin in the game. So even though when all said and done, even if I have the money to basically provide for them, I'm pretty sure we will, I'm not necessarily going to give them all of that. And here's the reason why. Again, I want them to have skin in the game, but I will supplement them. So basically, if they're doing well, if they can keep the grades up, and they basically are able to be self-sufficient, then of course I'm going to kind of give them a bonus. But I'm not just going to blatantly hand it over just because. And so that's kind of where I'm at today, present day. And it's shifted over time, but that's kind of just how it's evolved.
Makes sense. Well, Michael, this has been really enjoyable. I've learned a lot chatting with you. Really interesting to get your perspective as a family man who's fired while having a family. Where can listeners find out more about you, your work, what you're up to, and also tell us a little bit about the book you're writing?
Absolutely. So you can find me on my blog. It's called financiallyalert.com. And it's a blog that I started actually when I fired. It was something that I needed to do for myself just to keep my mind active since I was home playing with the kids. I wanted something that could, keep my mind active and just be able to grow myself. So created a blog that's been there for the last 5-6 years. And we talk about money mindset, financial freedom, financial independence, and really helping other people to realize that there's possibilities that you may not have realized existed. Secondly, I have a podcast called Breakthrough Millionaire that I co-host with my friend Marlon Smith, and he's a motivational speaker. So we actually talk about building wealth from the inside out. So we talk about motivation, we talk about money, goal setting, and just about values as an individual. So definitely check that out if that's of interest. And then with the book right now, the book that I'm writing is called The Fire Planner. So it's literally everything that you can to kind of understand fire from a high level and the entire process. So everything that I didn't know at the time that I wish I knew has gone into this book. So literally talking about, what is this fire movement and why is it taking catch, now, and why is it so popular? And what are the majority of people in fire doing? There's a lot of people that are doing extreme savings, and that's something that I never did, but makes sense. If you really want to basically have complete freedom, you can trade, a lot of your current lifestyle for that freedom. Or if you don't want it, like I didn't necessarily want that for myself, figure out a way to create more income. And so I kind of list out in the book all these different ways that you can achieve fire, and then ultimately how to create a plan around that so that you can find that baseline 4% rule kind of understanding of where you're going to really fire, in your mind. And then once you finally get there, what do you do? How do you ensure that you're continuing to grow and you just don't get there and fizzle out? The last thing you want to do, I think, is to get to this place of complete freedom and then just basically not grow anymore. That's the worst place. And that's why you see all the time people like go into retirement, they get depressed. You need something else to do. So whether that's, creating a business, whether that's, volunteering or being some larger part of something, I think you have to really kind of find a place for yourself to create value. And so that's, again, what the book is all about. And then fourthly, last is I have a private mastermind that I just created called Financial Freedom Pass. And so this is a private group coaching program that I basically take people every quarter. I bring people in and we literally discuss all these different components, whether it's mindset. A lot of times it's mindset. It's about strategies. It's about understanding where you are and just giving people the extra juice to kind of get them to the next step is really what it's all about.
Cool. Well, we'll look forward to sharing all those and linking to those in the show notes. Thank you so much for sharing today about your experience and journey and what you're up to, and look forward to sharing this with our audience.
It's been my pleasure, Andrew. I really appreciate it.
Cheers. Take care.
Take care.